I'll start anyhow. My name is Szántó. I'm an anthropologist and member of the Polányi Research Center, and I'm also leading an organization here in Hungary which is called Artemis Foundation. And I have the pleasure to chair the next session. But we are going to use 10 minutes, hopefully not from the time of the next session, but from the time of the break, to conduct the debate that was stolen from us by the cruel time in the last session. So we are having 10 minutes, you are having 10 minutes to put your questions to the presenters of the last session, and after 10 minutes I'm going to close this part of the program. We are going to start the next session, and I'm going to be a little bit unpolite. I have made, this 5 minutes, 1 minute posters, so I will ask the presenters of the next session to keep an eye on me, and I will try to keep the presentations to 20 minutes so that we can have more time for questions. All right. The floor is yours, dear audience. Okay.
Thank you. I don't know. So hi, my name is David Karl. I finished my PhD at the European University Institute in Florence, and I will have some remarks on Professor Kováts's presentation on the material basis of the current crisis. I think that what Professor Kováts talked about is extremely important, and I think that the discussion on European capitalisms and the specific form of integration between Western and Eastern European capitalisms is very relevant for understanding how the reactions and policy answers to the current crisis unfold. However, I would like to propose a number of supplementary remarks to that question, because I don't think that the story of dependency sums it up. I don't think that the question that Central Eastern European states depend on Western capital and that this creates resentment against refugees or migrants is the end of the story. I think that actually what is happening here are two things at least. The first is that migrants have been presented by the government as threats on the welfare state and on the job market for Hungarian citizens, but this is something which is also valid for the larger Central Eastern European region. So in that sense, I think that state-sponsored xenophobia is actually a means for these regimes to avoid investing, in fact, in the welfare state. We have had in Hungary huge mobilizations recently by teachers, by civil servants, and we know, based on the statistics, that actually Hungary is one among the OECD countries that spend the least on education and healthcare. I think that here, the mobilization of nationalist narratives and xenophobia and racism actually allows these regimes not to spend on welfare, on the welfare state, and to project and to reassure voters that actually their social rights are being defended, while actually there is no investment to speak of.
Sorry, but I'm going to use also my position to limit the time of the interventions. Can you formulate the question?
Yeah, this is the first remark. The second, I will be much briefer. The second is that I think it's also a regional story, and that the sort of coalition that is emerging among Visegrad countries should also be questioned, because these are specifically the markets which depend on foreign capital coming from Western Europe, and specifically from Germany. So the fact that there is a coalition of states emerging, spearheaded by Hungary, is, or might be also understood as an attempt to negotiate some forms of autonomy vis-à-vis capital coming from Germany in these countries. Thank you.
All right. We are collecting a couple of remarks and questions. I will ask you to keep the remarks and questions short. And yes. Okay. You wanted to talk?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't know. I was thinking you were sending a message to me. Sorry. Okay.
So my name is András Kováts from the Polish University in Istanbul. So my question is to Professor Rosa. So what is the political implication of your factual sort of finding for the Western European trade unions and socialist parties on the migration and refugee question?
Okay, Attila?
Just a short question to Clem. I think that this is a very important thing what you have touched upon. Nonetheless, we should also look at it from the point of view of refugees, because I think that actually now the refugees are not feeling so weak as the Saudi and Orientalism, because they can touch Europe, and you could see them on the highway going, and now in Greece they are with a kind of a liberty, so they have regained some agency with regard to that. I am not sure what is going to be the outcome of the conflict in the end, but we have to see that they are not behaving in the way how Orientalism supposed to them, right? That's
maybe two other questions, remarks?
Okay, I also would have a question concerning this, especially to Kumar and József Böröc, that so how could you interpret that even Syria was a French colony, however not France is the main destination country for them, so it's a bit contradict for me with the colonial logic.
No more questions? We have one more space. Maybe touching upon feminism too? Everything is touching upon feminism. Okay. So, do you want to answer? And I will call you out. Shall I?
no, they have the mic.
Attila told me that I should do so, but the micro will do.
Okay. Can you hear me? Or is it? Right. Well, I'm glad that I didn't understand your name. First question. I'm glad that my presentation gave you an opportunity to voice your insights about this phenomenon. I don't necessarily disagree with what you said. I don't think it's in any conflict with what I had said. I definitely did not say that this was the end of story, right? So please don't put that in my mouth. I did not say that. In fact, I clearly emphasized that this is background information. My argument was more contextual, but this is a piece of the puzzle that is not being talked about in the context of the so-called refugee crisis of Europe, end of quote. So that's why I thought it was important to mention that. What are the political implications of all this for West European unions, right? Well, I would broaden it. What are the political implications for pretty much anybody, any unions and anybody else? As for the West European unions, their positions regarding foreign labor, as well as foreign direct investment, has always been self-conflicted. And of course, on the very basic level, this is a competition for them that pushes down their wage levels, both foreign direct investment, which takes away their jobs, I'm quoting the rhetoric, and the presence of foreign workers who are less protected than they themselves will drive down wages and or take away the jobs. This is pretty much a well-known phenomenon worldwide. What makes it a little bit more complicated in the case of Western Europe, however, is that the trade unions are also part of the welfare state, both as, in many cases, stockholders in the welfare state system, as well as political stakeholders, and in that sense, they have a tremendous interest in maintaining the fiscal viability of the state and the welfare state system, which to a large extent depends on light labor that comes from abroad. So in that sense, in their dual position as on the one hand representatives of concrete workers in concrete workplaces where there is a conflict, and on the other hand as concrete representatives of workers as such in the welfare system, their positions are conflicted. I think that's basically the best I can say. As for labor unions in Eastern Europe, it's indicative to me that you didn't even think of that. What I mean is that they're so ineffectual that, and so corrupted, meaning that they have been so sold out, so fragmented and sold out that this is actually one aspect of the crisis, that the infrastructure, institutional infrastructure is not even in place. So the idea, for instance, of a national strike, I mean, just imagine that. On the one part, how much fun that would be, but the other side is how impossible it is to even conceive of something like that in a place like this. Now, why France and why not France and why Germany? And how does that? So if it's not France, then why? Since these had been French colonies, then why not? How does that not invalidate the colonial perspective? The colonial perspective does not require that migrants necessarily go only from the former colony to the former colonizer, although that happens, and France has quite a few of those, especially from North Africa and actually Africa, and so on. It just so happens that Germany has shown very perceptible signs of very openness to immigration over the last decades. It is also the case that it has a demographic crisis that requires the influx of labor. So because of that, and also the fact of the presence of a fairly large number of Muslim guest workers already in Germany, among whom you will also find, by the way, West Asian Arabs, not just Turks, also explains to some extent this attraction, meaning that there might be some among the current asylum seekers who already have family or friends that they are seeking to meet with. A third thing I would mention also is something that Salini in his introduction mentioned, since the crowd that is actually has shown up is very considerably wealthier and more well-educated than the average Syrian and Iraqi citizen. That also implies that these are people who have a fairly good familiarity with the conditions in Europe. They understand what Berlin and the other big cities are for immigrants, and therefore it is a fairly clearly explainable choice for them. What speaks in favor of your skepticism, on the other hand, is of course the fact that it's totally obvious that there are serious language issues which would be less so if they had gone to their former colonial power, and because France continues to have a certain linguistic presence in these countries. So in that sense it's sort of an ambiguous thing. But my most important point is, even if they all decided to go to a place that had no colonies whatsoever, okay, even then the colonial perspective would be perfectly relevant in many ways, but for instance in the ways in which Prem's presentation was starting to develop. Coloniality is not just a concrete, tangible history of sort of this vectorial relations between single colonizer countries and single colonies, but it is actually a frame of perceiving and arranging the world, and nobody can escape that. Neither the rich non-colonial West European countries, see Austria, for instance, nor those parts of the world that had never been colonized.
Just quickly with regards to Attila, yes.
Louder.
Sorry?
Louder.
Speak up.
Sorry, with regards to Attila's question, yes. One of the most interesting and best things that has happened in this migrant crisis is the migrants' refusal to behave in the Orientalist fashion that is presumed. I mean, if I had time, I would talk a little bit more about my disagreements with Said. For Said precisely, it's not important. I think he doesn't really spend enough time on how the Orientals respond to Occidental visions of them, and I'm more interested in the struggles to establish hegemonies rather than hegemony actually being established. With regards to Martin's question, I think Jože covered everything around it.
Susan, you want to add something? So thank you very much. Thank you for coming back for a short time. And I would like to ask the presenters of the next session to come on stage. The next session, where we are going to listen to 4 papers. And what is linking together these 4 presentations, I think, is the direct continuation of what we have heard in the introduction. We are going to be led further into the question what kind of crisis we are talking about from different vantage points, and I am sure that these different vantage points are going to shed new lights on how we define what is happening to us through this so-called refugee crisis. So if there is a crisis, what kind of crisis we are facing in different points of Europe. These different points are Greece, Eastern Europe. Hungary is part of Eastern Europe, but I think that there is a special Hungarian perspective here, and Austria. And I'm going to present you the authors of the papers, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to make sure that I'm not missing the pronunciation, so if I make mistake, I would like to excuse myself in advance. I would like to present you Savas Michael-Matsas, who is teaching in the University of Athens. I'm doing that? Okay, sorry. He's teaching philosophy and cultural studies. He's author of several books. And he's going to talk about the refugee crisis as it presents in Greece, not only as a global, as an economic crisis or a political crisis, but as the moment of truth for Europe. Then András Kováts from Menedék Association. He is an activist and an NGO leader, but he's also a researcher. And as a researcher, he works for Institute of Social Sciences of Hungarian Academy of Science. And he's going to talk about the securitization aspects of the refugee crisis. Then Dagmar Svendova, who is, as I understand well, she's a university person. She's a graduate from Nottingham Trent University, but she's also an activist. And she is representing also Transform Europe, which is a movement based in Vienna. And she's going to talk about the Eastern European vantage point. And then Lukas, who is also from Vienna, University of Vienna, and he is at the same time the General Secretary of the International Conference on Labour and Social History, and he is going to address more specifically the recent discourses in Austria. So I would like to ask the presenters the next presenter to take my place. And I will listen very carefully and attentively your discourse, but I'm also going to show you the sign of the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And first of all, frankly, I want to thank the organizers for this invitation. As some friends in the room probably they remember, the last time I spoke in Budapest, it was at the height of the Eurozone crisis centered in Greece, and in the aftermath of an important trial that I won after legal action by the Nazi Golden Dawn accusing me for conspiracy to establish a Judeo-Bolshevik regime in Greece. Now, I'm coming from the front line of the so-called refugee crisis. And with Greece, we threatened to be out this time not of the Eurozone, but from the Schengen zone, as well from Europe itself. It is always an understatement to call a tragedy a crisis. This applies now to what is called, to the so-called migrant or refugee crisis. In relation to the gigantic tide of mass migration that surged last year and is continuing or even escalating in 2016. The exodus of 1 million people, children, women, elders, young men, younger, mainly from Syria, Afghanistan, and other countries of the Middle East, Central Asia, Northern Africa, even Sub-Saharan Africa, from countries in war and social devastation, trying desperately to survive by reaching Europe, or rather fortress Europe, hostile Europe, and many of them meeting death in the sea graveyard of the Aegean or the Mediterranean as a whole, or in the so-called Western Balkan route. The dimensions of the tragedy can be seen in a few cold figures given by the report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or even by the Europol, the European Police. Just a few. In 2015, there was 856,000 sea arrivals from Greece, via Greece. In January 2016, in 1 month, another 60,000 officially came, despite bad weather and sea storms. In only 2 days, February 17, 18, 4,600 and 4,800 entered. In a week, on the 12th to 18th February this year, about 12,000. In the first month, 403 were found or declared drowned, dead. Most of them children and women. The fate of children is the most horrible aspect of the tragedy. According to the Europol, which cannot be accused to be leftist, from about 270,000 children that entered Europe in 2015, more than 10,000 disappeared, falling victims of gangs of traffickers and mob networks of child prostitution. Nevertheless, no child was found, nor a gang was dismantled, showing the criminal indifference, or to put it mildly, the benign neglect, or even protection by the relevant state authorities, who are responsible and guilty for this horrible crime against humanity. So, according to the Europol figures, at least about 5 billion euros were won by the gangs. Just in a few months, 6 months, from July 2015 until now. A recent typical manifestation of the overall European state attitude to the refugees in general and to children in particular is the following, officially reported by the United Nations High Commissioner report on refugees. I quote, on 15 February 2016, Austrian authorities informed the Slovenian police that unaccompanied and separated children not requesting asylum in Austria or expressing interest to request asylum in Germany will be returned from Austria to Slovenia, irrespective of being attached to a non-relative family. End of the quote. From the thousands that try to enter Europe through Greece every day, those lucky enough to avoid death in the sea or to be pushed back by the operation of the police, the Frontex, or now NATO very soon, back to Turkey. If they enter Greece, their ordeal continues with imprisonment in new militarized concentration camps, misnamed hotspots of registration demanded by the EU, or camps of relocation of refugees. But there are real concentration camps, we return back to the 40s in Europe. What a progress. Last year, even you remember, it was in August or September, they opened Buchenwald as a point of reception of refugees from Syria. And other places, well known by the genocide of the Jews by the Nazis during the war. Nothing forgotten, nothing forgiven. When the moment comes, those of them who are allowed to continue their odyssey in the Balkans towards Western and Northern Europe, they move through a social jungle full of obstacles and dangers. They march under the most inhuman conditions, without food, without shelter, under rain. They sleep in the streets or in the fields. They are stopped in every border, from Idomeni, the Greek Macedonian borders, and farther on, by barbed wire fences. I think the first who erected such a fence was Viktor Orban, of course. What a honor. So all these fences are reasoned by the local state, but with European Union backing. We have not to forget that. And just demonize real demons, by the way, but anyway, the local demons. They have protectors, even they are in clash between them. The fence in Macedonia, for example, it was European Union sponsored plan, and still is. So, they face that. They are suffering brutal repression by riot police and with special dogs beating the people, including the kids, trying, particularly the night, to go further. They are super exploited by the mafias. It is on the smallest sum, it was 500 euros to go from Turkey to a Greek island. And you can imagine similar, even more, you have to pay to go from Greece to Macedonia. And terrorism, real terror, by local mobs and fascist stormtroopers. Not only the Golden Dawn, my own friends. The refugees face no more just a fortress Europe. This is the second point that I want to stress. This fortress Europe was always a fortress Europe, confronting the weight of this destitute people trying to survive out of a situation created by Europe and the United States, but Europe as well. So, but now, from last year onwards, it is not just a fortress Europe. It is a European Union rapidly disintegrating along antagonistic nationalist lines. It's a new development. The so-called plans advanced by the European Union in Germany, not in 2015, for management of the migrant flows, proportional relocation, etc., quotas, failed until now to be implemented. Each European Union country started to take unilateral measures, reinstating border controls, dismantling step by step the Schengen zone of free movement of European Union citizens. After the euro currency, the European common currency, Schengen, the second pillar, and so-called achievement of the European capitalist integration is crumbling. The unchallenged until recently authority of Germany as the economic powerhouse of the European Union and of Angela Merkel herself as the undisputed political hegemon in Europe became, after summer 2015, things of the past memories. Even the deal Merkel-Erdogan to give Turkey 3 billion euros, etc., and promises for renewal of the negotiation for its entry in the European Union. We have, as our Turkish colleagues will develop that point, to create not a solution, but a buffer state to stop the flow from Syria and the Middle East. A recent but very significant for the loss of control by Berlin and Brussels event was the meeting in Vienna, called by Austria and the Russian government in the immediate aftermath of the European Union summit of February 18 and 19. Where, as you know, they have invited 9 Balkan countries: Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia, Macedonia, Croatia, Serbia, and Slovenia, totally ignoring the European Union summit deliberations or decisions of the previous day, just a few hours after that. At the pompously misnamed, I quote, Managing Migration Together Conference, which was the official name of this meeting, he's advising a de facto closing down of the Western Balkan route and the de facto exclusion of Greece out of the Schengen zone by closing the borders with non-Schengen neighboring countries, first of all with Macedonia. Commenting this gathering in Vienna, a high European Union official made the rather sick joke that it was a clumsy attempt to rebuild a new Austro-Hungarian empire. The United Nations High Commissioner, on the contrary, was headed to warn that what can befall this meeting in Vienna is, I quote, potential chaos. The Greek Foreign Minister Nikos, in an obvious understatement, spoke about a unilateral and unfriendly act, then followed by the recalling of the Greek ambassador in Vienna for deliberations in Athens. The so-called migrant crisis interacts with all the unresolved contradictions of the European Union, vulnerable and fragile after 9 years of the post-2008 global crisis of capitalism, with a stagnating economy and unresolved sovereign debt and banking crisis, with the Eurozone still in deeper and ever deeper trouble, with the workers and the popular strata suffering for years now, with the nightmare of chronic mass unemployment. In Greece, 67% of the youth between 18 and 24 years old are unemployed, with a degree by university but unemployed. We have the most cultivated and employed youth in Europe, a big success. So, you have this nightmare, pauperization by a non-stop draconian regime of austerity measures. So the centrifugal forces are strengthened all over the European Union now. After the danger represented by a Brexit from the Eurozone, or ways of the agenda, which never went back, still there. Now we have the prospect of a Brexit. After the Brexit, which is a possibility, and which compounds the crisis of the European Union project as a whole. And of course, Marine Le Pen speaks about the Frexit in France. And next year we have the presidential elections in France, and all the theological, Talmudic discussions in the Front National is fascist or right populist or whatever, there will be nothing. The whole political map will be changed if we don't act as urgently as possible. We and the French authorities as well. All the historical wounds of the continent after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union have been reopened again, as the Ukrainian events show it very clearly, And as we saw yesterday, the first day of this workshop, in the fantastic film about the atrocities in Rostock, 92. So it's not past. Nothing can be solved. And we live through the end of history, in the post-Cold War era, but with all these wounds of a transition that failed miserably to democracy and liberal capitalism, etc., are here. And we cannot explain the attitude of the Visegrad countries or the Vienna meeting that I mentioned before without the historical collapse of 1989, 1991, and then the demise of the Soviet Union. So now the impact of the world capitalist crisis revealed the enormous gap, first of all, and the balance of the European Union and the Eurozone between North and South. Second now, the so-called migrant crisis reveals another gap, another big abyss between West and East in Europe. The Visegrad 4 countries and their protectors, so-called protectors, the colonizers. I fully agree with the very splendid presentation in the previous session of Eastern Europe. The whole program of expansion of the European Union to the east, to the borders of in the former Soviet space is a plan of recolonization. From the beginning it was that and still is there. So political polarization follows social polarization and loss of legitimacy of all the ruling parliamentary parties, center-right and center-left in Europe. Economic nationalism rises together the far right, but from the other side, social resistance by the working class and polarized popular strata, and their fighting capacity is not crushed. A clear indication for it comes again from Greece. Despite the capitulation of the Tsipras government in July 2015 to the blackmail by the infamous Troika of the European Union, the European Central Bank and the IMF, despite the disappointment, confusion and bitterness produced by the betrayal of promises and expectation from an early end of austerity, at the end of 2015 until now, February of this year, 3 general strikes took place in Greece, and the rebellion by farmers which is continuing against the implementation of the order given last summer by the European Union and the IMF to the Greek government. Greece is a microcosm of the entire crisis of the European Union. Being its weakest link, now it became the broken link. And you know very well that if a link is broken, it's the chain which is broken, not just a link. Europe never recovered from the so-called Greek crisis. It's a European and international crisis. So, and all the packages of so-called bailout programs, they saved momentarily the German, the French banks, but not the system, and of course not Greece. That's all the Greek people. Now, being the broken link of the Eurozone and its scapegoat, Greeks are lazy, Greeks took all the loans, etc. Greece now becomes, as the gate of the European Union to the Middle East and the point of entry of the migrants' tide, the starting point of the disintegration of the Schengen zone, and it is blamed for it. Again, we are the scapegoat. The European Union-backed fence in the Macedonian border, even before the Austrian unilateral and friendly act, was a step to trap the refugees in Greece, which from a bankrupt, impoverished country will be transformed also into a black box for the so-called undesirable victims of wars and devastation launched by the civilized West, not only by the United States but by the European Union itself, as in Syria and Libya. The pressures by the European Union that Greece has to establish as soon as possible hotspots and camps of relocation have one target: to make possible to other European countries to send back the refugees to Greece as the first country of entry according to the rules of the Treaty of Dublin, from which Greece was de facto expelled in 2011 because of the crisis in Greece and the inhuman conditions of the places of imprisonment of refugees in such an infamous camp of Amygdaleza, which is a horrible prison, by the way, in Athens. Until now in Greece there are only 10,000 places for refugees near Athens and another 2,000 in Thessaloniki. Even if a few tens of thousands, according to the Greek government, are established in an economically ruined Greece, there will be no hope for them, never mind the hundreds of thousands or more that the European Union countries want to trap or eject back to the Greek black box. If these inhuman plans are implemented, Greece obviously will become a cemetery of shadows. Popularly, such European white Christian barbarism means nothing in a Europe where concentration camps like Luxemburg were reopened last year for the refugees. A Europe, yes, please, where the Danish state introduced a Nazi law to confiscate asylum seekers' cash and jewelry. Norwegian officials deport migrants over an Arctic border. Swedish vigilantes are pushing immigrants, and caravans of refugees are attacked by mobs in Czech Republic, Germany, Greece, Hungary or Britain. All these attacks are not isolated, spontaneous actions of politically confused, disorientated, ultra-conservative individuals or fringe groups. They are the poisonous product of state-sponsored xenophobia, state racism, particularly by bourgeois politicians who put their re-election above human life. They and their policies are to be blamed in the first place for the rise of the far right in Europe, of Marine Le Pen's Front National, or Alternative für Deutschland, of Islamophobic Pegida, of globally Nazis of the Golden Dawn. In the case of Greece, it's remarkable that despite the disastrous social conditions, a very powerful popular movement of solidarity, this is my last point, to the refugees has been developed from below, together with constant mobilization against xenophobia, not just solidarity, but to have mobilization to fight back the fascists attacking the refugees. We will not allow them to kill our brothers and sisters. It is not an accident that the state authorities as well as the European Union and NATO are very hostile and try to prevent or forbid any contacts of fraternization between rank-and-file solidarity networks and workers' organizations with the refugees. To militarize the hotspots and refugee camps, and permitting only to officials or officially accepted by NATO itself, NGOs to meet the refugees. Nobody, you are imprisoned in Greece, in Chios, in Lesbos, etc. if you help the refugees. There are such cases. Together with the militarization of management of the migrant crisis comes now an even more sinister development, the deployment of NATO forces in the Aegean and the Greek-Turkish borders, with the full agreement of the European Union as well as the Erdogan and Cyprus governments, who they called them to come, by the way, officially. The pretext it is the smugglers or the pushing back operations, but in matter of fact we have a unification of the crisis in Europe and the war in the east of Europe with the war in the Middle East, with Middle East chaos. It is not just that we have a reunification, we have now a NATO front coming from the Baltic Sea to the Aegean and to the Mediterranean. The world war is more than ever now a danger. We will not forget the lessons of history. And I have to finish. So we have to see that both the so-called refugee crisis or the disintegration of the European Union project, because this is what we are passing through now, are both the byproducts of this fantastic world crisis after 2007-2008, the implosion of global capital globalization. And if we don't deal with the historical material basis of this crisis with many aspects, one is the refugee, it's the economic or social crisis, etc., political crisis, we cannot go out. So a few suggestions. We have to follow this strategic orientation, but that don't mean that we wait an automatic collapse of this hell in which we are. So we have to, first of all, to break down the fences, the concentration camps for refugees, all anti-immigrant laws and the rules. we have to build forces, front of emancipation from below, for that. To build solidarity networks throughout Europe with the refugees, connecting them with the European workers and popular organizations and movements, resist any penalization of rank-and-file solidarity work and or militarization. To fight xenophobia, racism, far-right and fascist gangs, to end the war, the imperialist war or war by proxy or whatever, or the sectarian divide between Sunni and Shias that we know in our area. We have to fight against the war, to disband NATO, its military bases, its war machine, 25 years or more after disbanding the Warsaw Pact forces. And to break down the imperialist fortress Europe of big capital. Europe is at the crossroads. Either it will be buried under the ruins of the failure of the European Union disintegration into nationalist lines in the service of the interests and privileges of the ruling few from above, or it will be unified on new social basis of a socialist and internationalist character, which could include also the integration of the refugees, victims of the same global bankruptcy of decayed capitalism. So the warning a century ago by Rosa Luxemburg about world socialism or barbarism is more than ever actual. Thank you.
The money's on the time, what would it be now? I mean, at least I see.
Is it on? Sorry.
Because that's the feedback that's coming from. Sorry.
It's being warming up.
What's that one?
No, it's warming up. The beam is warming up.
Okay, that's going to be fine. Anyway, I'm going to read some of the stuff and you can listen to me rather than reading it.
Just come and get
From
here.
there, the rest is just some reminders and some figures as well. So, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you for a couple of minutes. As Diana already said, I'm coming from the NGO sector. I'm coming from the field, being responsible for an NGO doing some advocacy and much more social and integration services for people arriving in the country, be them asylum seekers, refugees, be them people without any legal status. This presentation will be slightly more technical than the previous one, and though it will have a special Hungarian, at least this is why I hope it will have a special Hungarian perspective, I won't refer much on Hungary directly, rather than talking about one thing which is, at least looking at it from my position, is one of the fundamental elements of both refugee affairs in Europe in general, as well as the present migration crisis. It is called the Common European Asylum System, and however much it may seem surprising, there is such a thing, at least there is such a thing in so-called Eurotalk or Eurospeak. And I think it's important to listen to the tone of this discourse and of this talk, which is from the European Commission and which is about at least the wishful thinking of policymakers these days in Europe. So what is the Common European Asylum System? The present state of it, as the Commission says, in the EU it is an area which is an area of open borders and freedom of movement. Countries share the same fundamental values and states need to have a joint approach to guarantee high standards of protection for refugees. Clear so far? Procedures must at the same time be fair and effective throughout the EU and in purpose and use. So this is for the present situation. So this is what is set forth in the policy talk. There is even a future plan or a future perspective to this, which is about bringing more harmonization to standards of protection by further aligning the EU states' asylum legislation, effective and well-supported practical cooperation, increased solidarity and sense of responsibility among EU states and between the EU and non-EU countries. Does it ring a bell? Anyone looking back to the past year? So what is the common asylum system in practice? It is a set of legal norms and legal frameworks which are compulsory to European member states. So adherence and also transposition of the legal norms is one of the essential elements of being a member of this political, economic and social union. One is the Asylum Procedures Directive, which aims at far, quick and good quality asylum decisions. The other one is a directive on the reception conditions, which talks about how people should be received, how people should be accommodated during their seeking asylum. The third one is the so-called Qualification Directive, which clarifies the grounds for granting international protection. Actually, this is the one which is responsible for using the same norms and the same standards when asylum decisions are made. And then there is a directive on temporary protection. This is especially for cases when there is a mass influx of people, when there are tens or even hundreds of thousands of people arrive from one particular region or from one particular conflict, and it would make possible to set aside very complicated legal norms, and a slightly simpler form of protection could be applied. And then there is a regulation, it's called the Dublin Regulation, which is supposed to share the responsibility and which is supposed to set the algorithm of sharing responsibility among the states who process the asylum claims as well as who provide protection for asylum seekers. And then there is a system called Eurodac where people are supposed to be fingerprinted for the sake of identification, but also for the sake of making this database available for law enforcement authorities in order to protect European communities from those who are probably not as benevolent as the vast majority of those seeking asylum. There are a set of other norms as well, such as financial compensation mechanism. There is a section on family unification, which is opened up for refugees. In the return directive, the non-refoulement principle is secured. But all in all, this is what is called the common asylum system. And now look at the present situation and look at the reality, some figures. The first is the monthly number of asylum seekers or asylum applications in the EU in 2014 and 2015, and you can see it stops in October, but I mean it goes on like this, so there's an exponential increase in the number of people asking for asylum. And here are the crude figures. Last year it was 1.3 million people submitting or lodging an asylum claim in one of the other European member states. And what you can see from the map in the left, that the distribution is pretty unequal. So you can see countries such as Germany, around or over 1 million asylum seekers, but even Hungary and Sweden fare pretty well. Whereas if you look at other countries such as Portugal, even Spain, Ireland, or the Baltic states, there's hardly any applications submitted. And then the other side of the chart is about the asylum applications per 100,000 locals. So it's the per capita proportion of asylum applications, and you can see a huge inequality between member states, with Hungary on top, followed up by Sweden and Austria, and in the bottom such countries as Slovakia, Croatia, Romania, Czech Republic, Slovenia, and so on. But even the EU average is 255 asylum seekers per 1,000 locals, whereas the figure in Hungary, for instance, is 1.7 thousand, or the figure in Sweden is 1.6 thousand. So there are enormous and huge inequalities in the numbers. And when it comes to the recognition rates and the likelihood that somebody gets asylum, then there are huge differences. Actually, there's a very good study by a Dutch research institute which not only presents the crude figures of the overall likelihood of being granted asylum, which varies between, I'm looking at the EU member states, varies between something like, I would say 55% and also Bulgaria is the top, which is over 80%, and Hungary is the bottom, which is 9%. But if you adjust it by the countries of origin, and if you adjust it by the other circumstances, such as gender, such as age, such as the grounds for persecution, there is still a huge difference between European member states. Roughly the likelihood of getting asylum in country A than country B can be more than twofold, which is a clear trigger for choosing one country over the other, and which is a clear indication that that harmonization, which is part of the European, harmonization of standards, which is part of the European Common Asylum System, is just far from being realized. And this is the other thing, which is the Dublin system. Actually, the figures are not that recent, but at least the officially available figures are not that recent. So it is, it should be reflected upon an annual intake of roughly 300,000 people. But you still can see that the actual initiations of the so-called Dublin transfers, where the people are transferred to countries which are supposed to be responsible for the process of the claim, the initiations are around, at the maximum around 50,000, so it's roughly 15% of the total number of asylum seekers, whereas the actual execution, where people are transferred from one country to the other, remains around 10,000, which is usually 2–3% of the total case. So this is a marginal, at the moment this is a marginal and clearly non-working or unoperational element. So, concluding on this, I would, I'm not saying happily, but I would readily call the Common Asylum System as a failed system, because there are all kinds of dysfunctions. The first and main thing is that there are big and huge structural and implementation dysfunctions in the system. The Dublin system doesn't work, there's no quality control over neither the qualification issues nor the overall protection standards. The reception standards are extremely unequal, not only the technical parts of it, but also the huge differences between living standards in one or the other member states, and the return element of it, which affects or should affect roughly 50% of asylum seekers every year, clearly doesn't work. There is a second layer of the failure, which is the system overall. This is a recent thing. So for years, the asylum system, so the time when the asylum system became sort of full and seemingly operational, the annual number of asylum seekers was around 250, 300,000, 350,000. And already in the year of 2014, the numbers started to rise. And then the same followed last year, and the numbers are still rising. So simply, there is no capacity, there is a bottleneck in the whole system. There is no capacity for registration, processing, accommodation, return. So the whole system is in ruins. And then the third issue, which is partly already a consequence, but also a big trigger of the failure, is non-cooperation of and by member states. So there is a great deal of free riding. The Greek example used to be the first from 2011, but last year Hungary followed up with that, and most recently we can see Austria is encouraging its neighbors to go separate ways. But ironically and cunningly, it's not only those countries which seemingly don't receive many people or reluctant to receive people, but those countries, for instance Germany, which seems to be the core country, tends to turn for and look after unilateral solutions. So the crisis intervention is far from, and I'm talking about the systemic crisis here, but the crisis intervention is far from being harmonized and harmonious and being done at the level of the Union. And what the result is, and actually we heard a lot about it in the previous presentation, that there is a growing political tension all around the EU, among the member states. There is public discontent at the level of member states, and the crisis plans and the crisis solutions are pretty much delayed. And of course the question of responsibility. So everybody is, well, I mean, we think to a certain extent the member states are pointing at each other, but there is a much more solid argument about the responsible, which is the migrants or the asylum seekers themselves. So that's the ultimate point here, that the whole migration issue and the whole problem and crisis is boiled down to a discourse when the center of the problem is the migrant, him or herself. And this is the discursive framework where either at the level of member states or at the level, even increasingly at the level of the European Union, solutions are sought after. First issue is the situation is increasingly framed as a security issue. So when we talk about immigration, we tend to talk about the threat to public order, threat to national security, and which leads to the risk of terrorism. But the situation is very often framed as an economic issue as well. Immigration, which is either a threat to the labor market, these people are taking more jobs, or if they don't, then they are burdened on the welfare state. Sometimes these arguments go hand in hand with this inherent contradiction, not very much disturbing those who are claiming them. And then the last, but equally important and strong argument is the situation as a cultural conflict. So immigration is a threat to cultural integrity, which is about our democratic values or freedoms, which are at risk at the moment. And the Christian Europe is becoming increasingly at risk, which leads very, very often to a clearly upfront Islamophobic discourse. Actually, these discourses are usually articulated in the more marginalized, non-mainstream, far-right political positions, but not exclusively. Hungary is one of the examples where actually this discourse and the policies and reactions based on these discourses came from the establishment, came from the mainstream. So this is the discourse of Mr. Orbán, and this is very much influences the present day's political and public talk about the present migration or asylum crisis. Well, there are different possible interpretative frameworks to understand this discourse. So we can translate it either to the framework of securitization, which is the concept based on the Copenhagen school and Ole Weber coined on the term. When we consider the whole story as a speech act, where there is a securitizing actor which designates and attributes a threat to a so-called referent object, and declares, and that's the important thing, that the threat is no longer particular and no longer technical, but there is an existential threat implying a right to use extraordinary measures. And that's another key point today's political developments, that there are extraordinary measures, there are states of emergency. In Hungary there is still a state of emergency in force. I don't know how many of Hungarians are aware of that, but actually it was declared last October and it hasn't been withdrawn since then, so it keeps prolonged. Not due to the migration crisis, but in France there is a state of emergency, and actually there is just an amendment of a constitution being prepared and pushed for by the Hungarian government. So actually all these discourses point direct to the same direction. But you can also frame it and try to understand this present situation with the concept of risk, or the concept of free society by Ulrich Beck, which is probably a more equally distributed concept in terms of the actor and the object of the act, because it involves the active participation and presence of the actor and of the speaker. So when we talk about risk, we talk about the anticipation of a catastrophe, of a problem, of a crisis. And actually the risk itself exists in a permanent state of virtuality. It is never realized. It is a topical issue and it is an anticipated issue. So the risk can only become real, but once the risk becomes real, then it's no longer a risk. This is a crisis or this is a catastrophe. But we can maintain this discourse, and we can keep up this this type of references. It is very typical and topical from Hungary after the 15th or 16th of October, when the borders were virtually closed, the number of asylum seekers dropped near zero. And instead of losing up, instead of easing out a little bit, the government discourse and propaganda went on, talking about anticipated risk. So if we let it go, if we release it, then it will happen. What happens in Germany these days, what happened in Poland, what happens in the Balkans or in Greece, will happen in Hungary if we lose our consciousness. And then you can look at the whole story as a moral panic, which is more embedded in the psychological-based literature, which is coined by, well, it's not psychology, but the founder of the argument was a sociologist, Stanley Cohen, which is about the general attitude and the general disposition of a community about something, and this is important here, that very often more arguments about this crisis are that this crisis is a non-existent thing. So this is something which is only existing in the public discourse or in the discursive framework. This argument says otherwise. So actually this something does exist. So there is something which can be pointed at as a source of moral panic. The only problem with it is that it is exaggerated. It is exaggerated in two ways. One way that it is exaggerated compared to other perceptions. So the particular perception, which is used as a dominant discourse, exaggerates the phenomenon compared to vis-a-vis other perceptions, or it is exaggerated in a context or in comparison with other social problems or other problems in general, which can be more pressing or more pertinent. So what is at stake looking at all these issues and looking at the European Union? One issue is, and it's clearly a big danger, that the renationalization of the EU, which is contrary to the process that has taken place for the past, I would say, 15 years or even 2 decades. The other issue, which has probably already happened, or probably it hasn't even existed in the first place, dismantling the Common European Asylum System, which probably not many would leap after. However, what is underway is the dismantling of Schengen and dismantling of the internal freedom of movement, which would have a much more crucial implications on the present circumstances in Europe. Emerging, competitive, non-cooperating nation-states, ethnocentric nationalist governments, and their support could easily be a protracted status of emergency or the ongoing and sneaking in curtailing of fundamental rights, which is a big achievement of the Union, ending up from political tensions and instabilities in the peripheries, but increasingly not only in the peripheries, but in the central or more central regions at them. And then the last slide is about solutions offered at the moment, what are in the pipeline, and it will be a very short part of the presentation. One issue is what the Common Asylum System tries to survive the problem or the crisis is setting up registration hotspots. We already heard about their quality and their prospect. And actually the problem is that it's a very delayed process, and the frontline countries clearly have no political and social interest in compliance in this process, as the burden of reception and the responsibility of handling the non-qualifying asylum seekers, which are usually many, and this is what we tend to forget, will clearly lay with these countries. Right now it is Greece and Italy. The other thing is the relocation scheme, which is already related to and attached to the registration system, which is called shortly Rosa system, which is not only about its magnitude, but also in its nature. It's very rigid, it's very difficult to implement, it's very easy to opt out or at least rely on the system, and it doesn't acknowledge at all the already existing very, very strong, spontaneous movements of people arriving in the European Union. And then this is the German Plan B, strengthening protection in Turkey and in the Balkans, which Austria starts to negotiate for as well, which is, on one hand, it's a very slow process, on the other hand, it is politically pretty problematic, so countries can enter into very unfavorable foreign affairs negotiations or blackmail situations. And then opening up the temporary protection alternative. I mean, Attila talked about it a lot, but I mean, looking at the core problems and the core shortcomings, this is not an alternative. I mean, it's not solution to the problem. It wouldn't slow down the number of arrivals. It wouldn't create a more equal and more fair distribution of the people. It would just strengthen another type of social and legal status on the case files. And then, obviously, enhancing return and readmission. That's again the German flagship these days that can convince the increasingly hostile public. There's simply no capacity and no coordination in this manner, in this matter. So at the moment there are millions of people who are missing the registration from the registration system, with not much likelihood to trace them down and to pack them up and to find them or out, however terrible it may sound at this stage and in this room. And then, obviously, the ultimate answer, but this is more about daydreaming, stabilizing or stability in general in the Middle East. The EU is simply incapable to deal with it, so there is neither political power or economic power or military power, nor will to get involved in it, so it is simply beyond control for the time being. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. As I was introduced at the beginning, my name is Dagmar Svendova. I am here as a representative of the Transform Europe, which is a network of 28 European organizations from 19 countries. The Transform is active in the field of political education and critical scientific analysis, and is the recognized corresponding political foundation of the European Left Party. So that's for a short introduction. As the populist right seems to be winning throughout Europe with its clash of civilization narrative as nationals, against them immigrants, influencing growing section of both conservative and social democratic parties, it is urgently necessary for the left forces to consider what this unprecedented movement of population means in terms of freedom of movements, social and political rights, and labor market regulation. The stakes are high, as people are dying in the Mediterranean as they try to reach an ever more hermetic EU, fleeing wars and structural misery in hopes of better future. In the meantime, the left should be calling for a new vision of geopolitics, articulating an alternative neighborhood policy, along with the issue of democratic and social rights for the refugees in their countries of origin or residence. Therefore, Transform has decided, in cooperation with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, to establish a new working group on migration, which should start their work in the beginning of 2016. This working group should bring together academics, immigrant activists, and activists from the solidarity movements, as well as trade unionists. Moreover, through the web platform Change for All, Transform committed itself to movement of solidarity with refugees looking for safe routes to Europe. Additionally, Transform has also contributed to the European discussion on the migration by providing the left and solidarity movements with a policy paper entitled "A Left-Wing Responses to Asylum Crisis and Migration Policy," which some of the copies I have displayed on the table at the entrance of the room, but it can be downloaded from the Transform web pages. Presented measures aim to outline the key points of the forward-thinking European asylum and immigration policy. Here I show just the main points or the main chapters. It contains the emergency measures, as you can see. So there is a border management, guarantee legal access to the EU, give political asylum meaning once more, bottom-up harmonization, a migration policy based on law, against the concept of immigration as a tool. So the other things are structural measures and immigration and refugees integration. In my presentation, I was asked to concentrate on the Eastern European area. Due to the lack of time and some fallbacks of receiving the accurate information from some of my cooperatives and our members' organization, I was pressed to a little bit readjust to the topic. Although I will be touching the area, I would rather concentrate on the Czech Republic. This would also add to the information you have been receiving from some of the previous presenters, so I hope that this will be actually valuable and interesting for you to hear. So let's follow on. So, there are several perceptions of the current migration situation in Czech Republic. One of them is that Czechs do not like the idea of having lots of foreigners living amongst them. It is said that Czechs are in general not fond of migrants and are reluctant to continue accepting the new incomers. The reality is somehow different. Although according to recent polls, the 65% of Czech population do not want refugees. I will come back and talk about this a little bit later on. For example, a visitor to one of the largest shopping malls in Prague would almost certainly notice that he or she is served frequently by foreigner workers, primarily by economic migrants from CEE regions. This is significant actually, and it reflects the Czech reality. As you can see on the slide, there is the proportion of the foreigners in total living in Czech Republic at the moment. So in total, in Czech Republic live 4,600, 1,000 foreigners belonging to approximately 50 nationalities. This proves wrong the allegation that Czech society is ethnically homogeneous, contains a really small number of foreigners, and displays the signs of xenophobia. The situation in Prague is particularly interesting since the city has a significant higher share of foreigners in comparison to the rest of the country. In fact, while the whole country share of foreigners reaches 5%, 36% of them actually live in Prague, making up to 13% of the city dwellers. In a long-term perspective, the coexistence of foreigners in Czech Republic never seems to pose any sort of serious problems. Naturally, in comparison to Prague, share of the foreigners living in the villages and towns is sustainably lower. The situation in Central Europe and in the Czech Republic in particular is centrally influenced by the historical circumstances of the social developments. Hence, I would like to open a second part of my presentation by referring to Tony Wood, a British historian and intellectual who has once said, how much of the historical alphabetism may be squeezed into the analogy, and to react this way to an argument that this is quite frequently used while the approach of the Central and Eastern Europe states towards current immigration situation is being discussed. The argument of reminding the citizen of this region about the help that was provided by the Western societies to the Eastern European immigrants in 1956 and 1968, the help that these countries shall be thankful for. For example, I would like to mention an UN refugee agency campaign, which you can see displayed now, which is aiming to refugees, and it's in Czech language webpage, has announced the launch of campaign. Okay, sorry, no. So this campaign is aiming really to the Czech people, trying to turn out the Czech population opinion positively towards the immigrants. But I'm really worried by doing this that it will steer a totally different reaction from the population. So I really fear that this is going to have a total opposite influence or effect than it was aiming for, and this is a big pity. And what about the situation in CEE region? The region specifics appears in different ways, from very slight and unimportant to the striking ones in their political consequences. In this context, I would like to refer to the idea of Veronika Struša-Salminen, a Czech left-wing historian currently living in Finland. She says, the current refugee migration crisis has highlighted the lack of unity in a very apparent way, in an old new gap between East and West. This is a further political movement that was not actually caused by the migration crisis. On contrary, the difference in the approaches towards the crisis is caused by the mutual non-understanding between East and West. As long as we will not take into consideration, we will keep ending up with the dead end of assuming the different political roles of European political forces. The migration crisis has simply brought Eastern Europe. The migration crisis has simply brought this previously unnoticed reality into spotlight. The approach towards Eastern Europe never has been an even and symmetrical process. The process of EU expansion to the east took place under the flag of semi-periphery. As a result, this region came under an unrestricted and brutal globalization on the political, cultural and economical levels. Development transformation model based on the deep-rooted liberalism has brought the early unknown level of social inequity, criminality, poverty and unemployment, selfishness and consumption-oriented democracy. No one in Europe, including the left forces, is not mentioning that Europe itself have plenty of economic migrants, and these people are formally EU citizens. But in some regions, for example in Bulgaria, there are plenty of people who are living on less than €100 amount, and thus it shall not be surprising to see EU beggars on the streets of EU cities. All this, by the way, influences the perception of the migration crisis by the inhabitants of CEE, who are already affected by the significant level of poverty. The migration crisis demonstrates, according to Veronika Struša-Salminen, that the crisis of the semi-periphery always means the crisis of the center. This is valid as well for the left movement. The crisis at the left structure of the semi-periphery is the reflection of the crisis of the left through as whole. This is a crisis of the insufficient and unconvincing leftist vision. The migration crisis reflects and highlights the crisis in an approach of Czech population towards European integration and towards EU itself. So I will skip these. I think I need 2 more.
Yeah.
As long as the migration problematics is concerned, it will be interesting to observe how Czech treats the refugees. You can see the first slide. It is evident that part of the fear of refugee society is possessed by the far stronger fear of the Islam. It's 83%. In the second question, people are asked not just about the refugees, but about people of a certain religion without regards from where they come from. How this became possible? We tend to think that this is the result of the dumb anti-Islam propaganda of the Bush Junior administration related to events of September 2001. This is a propaganda rooted in the geostrategical consideration. And it's necessary to add that current system of the differentiated approach toward the Islamic countries that are sorted to the good, Saudi Arabia, Gulf nation, and the evil ones, as well as the suspicion of the ES export of oil beyond the scope of the Western military targets. As you can see, the Czech TV presented after the Paris attack on 22nd of November 2015 these polls. What should EU do after Paris attack? You can see that it's clearly, the answers has been clearly linked to the war control on refugees. Consequences between the terrorism and the threat of migration. 41% have replied it is direct. Attitude of Czech society towards the reason of immigration. The reasons that are considered acceptable by most of the society are the education, war, famine, natural calamity at the home countries, and unification of families. Less than half of the people agree with the reason of persecution on political, racial, religious grounds. Close to 46%. On the business and employment, 29%. And because they like it here, 24%. These numbers clearly show that Czech society is not generally against the incomers, and it is ready to accept them, but only on certain grounds. This is also related to the way the mass media present incomers and the grounds for the arrivals, as well as the social and economic impacts in immigration local population, both real and perceived. Fear of employment, competition, and in the possible reduction of existing welfare programs. I would like to just say before I make my conclusion, because the time is running short, I'm not such a fast speaker, is that you have to also take into consideration the current political situation in Czech Republic. There are upcoming regional elections, next year there are government election, and the current polarization of the public on the right or on the right there. They have the status, they know what they want. But let's say from the more middle and left wing, it's really problematic. Even the left wing voter will be 50 to 50%. when they start to talk about the migration, the solution, and the possibilities. What is now advocated strongly, it's really this fear. It's fear of, it's really an Islamophobia. There's no discussion in the middle about what we should do, how to treat, how to integrate. Although the Czech government has implemented new new strategies for the integration policies, for example. At the moment, when you start to speak and you say something which is pro-migrants, in favor of migrants, you're branded as being sunshine. Okay, we want to welcome everyone. You are not taking care about the outcomes or fallbacks. You are just that sunny person with a wide smile, so you are branded. If you say something which is a little bit slightly critical towards the migrants or the refugees, then you are immediately branded as a xenophobe. So this is extremely difficult situation which we are having now in my country. And as a transform, we are trying to bring this discussion to this kind of environment. So in the end of last year, we have actually organized a wide open seminar workshop for the left-wing oriented movements, social societies, but also political parties in Czech Republic, in order to offer them the space to discuss openly between themselves. This was actually quite a success, and we would like to continue working in that direction, because at the moment these type of discussions are missing. Thank you very much for the attention. Just allow me the last remark. Transform has issued this yearbook. I have a couple of copies with me, and if anyone would be interested, please come forward and we can discuss.
First of all, thanks a lot also on my behalf for the organizers of inviting me and having me here. I'm the only one that keeps you from lunch, so I will try to keep it really short. And yeah, cut the crap, as they say. I will try to briefly give an incomplete and rather erratic overview on refugee discourses in Austria and some insights in current political developments. Asylum applications in Austria have been rising since May 2014 and almost continuously every month, alongside with several refugee movements into Europe, especially alongside what has been framed and called the Balkan route. In Austria, most refugees had to register in a large federal refugee camp near Vienna, Reiskirchen, you might know the name. And the rising number of asylum applications led to the camp being totally crowded already in late 2014, long before the outbreak of what has been framed as the refugee crisis, although I actually don't like the term at all. Actually, everybody in the field of asylum, or working in the field of asylum, knew that the Austrian state would have to massively increase accommodation facilities for refugees. But the Austrian government and the Austrian authorities, especially the Ministry of the Interior, worked on the conscious escalation to create an artificial crisis of accommodation and supply of refugees. A staged and orchestrated emergency to create a particular narrative. The amount of arriving refugees overburdens the Austrian society. That's the picture they tried quite successfully to create. And in July 2015, more than 4,500 refugees lived in this camp I mentioned, with the maximum official capacity being 1,000 persons. Most of the refugees lived in private tents on the outside, and improvised refugee tent camps popped up all over Austria. An important caesura during this month, which hasn't been mentioned up to now during this workshop, is that thousands of people began, often past traditional actors of the so-called civil society, for what reason soever, to help and supply refugees, and on a certain level also to form collectives. Thousands of people began to become politically active for religious reasons or because of imagined liberal Western values with the corresponding notion of superiority, or explicitly for left-wing or radical left-wing motives. And then in late August, within a few days, events unfolded that quite rapidly changed the situation in Austria for a couple of weeks. The German government declared that no deportations under the Dublin regulations will be enforced for Syrian refugees. Hungarian authorities limited the access to Keleti, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, to the major train station in Budapest, and pictures went around the globe. An important incident in late August, on the 27th of August, 71 dead refugees were found in a refrigerated truck near Pandorf in the east of Austria. You probably have heard about the tragedy. A few days later, the last day of August, trains with hundreds of refugees arrived in Vienna from Budapest or from Hungary, and the Austrian police, for the first time, let them travel on to Germany without any intervention. And three days later, the 3rd of September, pictures of 3-year-old Aida, a Syrian refugee from Polányi, dead on the Turkish coast of Bodrum, were widely shared by the media, and the next day the Austrian-Hungarian border was opened, meaning that refugees could travel onwards without registration or police intervention. Internal contradictions within the European state ensemble, the massive pressure from refugee movements, and we had a discussion. I wouldn't underestimate the role of agency in this context, and to a limited extent also mobilizations in different European countries, also in Austria, blew a hole into an important part of the fortress of Europe. And for a few weeks, more or less safe, I don't want to romanticize the ways my refugees had to travel on the Balkan route, but more or less safe, meaning unregistered and without police interference. Passage for refugees from Greece to the north or northwest of Europe was possible. Suddenly the slogan in Austria of refugees welcome became hegemonic, at least for a few weeks. This occurred not because of a shift in the balance of forces or recomposition of the political landscape, but was influenced by a variety of factors. On the one hand, Austria predominantly was a transit country for refugees going to the north or west, and the Austrian state had no interest at all in slowing down a movement whose major destinations were beyond Austria. On the other hand, tens of thousands of refugees, a social movement in the true sense of the word, were on the move on the Balkans and had considerable support inside Austria, at least temporarily. This support from below was adopted by the political establishment and framed into the nationalist discourse of Austria is helping refugees. And also an important political fact that a faction within Austrian social democracy, and this is by no means any kind of electoral preference, statement on my behalf, embraced the hegemonic discourse in favor of helping refugees for the upcoming local elections in Vienna in early October 2015. And finally, hegemonic discourses were also shaped by the racist or culturally racist notion, Austria is far better than Hungary. That was one of the major motives of important political actors. And this is by no means also an advocacy for the current Hungarian government, but traditionally political criticism on Hungarian politics or Eastern European politics in general, although you know geographically where Austria is and where there is the east and the west. Interesting fact. In Austria always comes along with a notion of superiority. For example, in this particular context, Hungary was and is usually portrayed as a country incompatible with liberal Western values. Apart from the fact, what Susan Zimmerman mentioned earlier, that Western liberal values are an instrument of power and subordination in contemporary capitalism, nobody in Austria talked about Hungarians helping refugees in Budapest, or I will mispronounce the name again, or wherever in Hungary. Hungary. And secondly, the Austrian government was and still is amongst the loudest advocates of protecting the external borders of the European Union and has put considerable pressure on Hungary, and now, as we have heard, on Greece, to step up border security. My argument being the political outcry of the Austrian government over the fence at the Hungarian-Serbian border was cynical. The events of the last days, with the Austrian government putting enormous pressures with an unilateral and unfriendly act on the Greek government to step up border security, reinforced this thesis. Furthermore, in the whole of Europe, there has never been an outcry on the fence, the Frontex-funded, EU Commission-funded fences on the Bulgarian-Turkish border or on the Greek-Turkish border. But back to my main argument. The official political climate in favor of helping refugees was fragmented and fragile and didn't last very long. Already in October 2015, the Austrian government, under growing pressure from the extreme right wing and its major political expression, the Austrian Freedom Party, and as you probably know, this is a very, very important political force in Austria, began discussing that the refugee movement had to be regulated. And first legal measures against refugees, compulsory lessons in Austrian values, whatever those might be, were taken. Rapidly, the official discourse changed and was accelerated by the terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015 and the incidents in Cologne and other German cities on New Year's Eve. But I would say that those events were not monopoles for the current state of affairs. Rather, it has sadly, once again, become obvious that racism, and especially anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia, that have been massively cultivated by the political right wing over the last years, is deeply rooted in Austria, and the Austrian government had welcome excuses for pushing through measures of securitization and militarization. The Austrian government began to reinforce the strict border regime on the Austrian-Slovenian border, where the major refugee route on the Balkans had shifted after the closure of the Hungarian-Serbian border in mid-September, with the fence being finished and the rail track from Szeged to Subotica being closed. The military, and that's actually, I mean, it's unusual nowadays, but due to Austrian history, the deployment of the military for internal reasons is a delicate issue, usually heavily criticized by Austrian social democracy due to the events of the Civil War, but not in this context. The military has been deployed on the border to assist the Austrian police in securing Austrian borders, and the first border fences were built. Yeah. In the words of the Austrian Social Democratic Chancellor, it's not a fence, but a door, and I quote, a door with a, what did he say? With a side lash, I think, something like that. That's the same Chancellor that heavily criticized the Hungarian fence. And at the same time, legal measures that have been taken to further restrict asylum rights in Austria. And recently, the Austrian government passed an upper limit on daily asylum applications that is clearly incompatible with the Geneva Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights. And I say this without having any illusions in the rule of law under the conditions of structural social exclusion in class societies. But those measures are nonetheless an indication of the increasingly authoritarian character of the neoliberal state. And also the racist classification of refugees into war refugees and economic refugees has been stepped up. And the new Social Democratic Minister of Defense is advocating mass deportations of refugees who are not granted asylum or subsidiary protection, which is another form of international protection. Especially the Austrian Conservative People's Party has also launched a campaign against what they call welcome culture, directed not only against refugees, but also against persons who help refugees in what way soever, with the aim of, and I quote the Austrian Minister of the Interior, making Austria unattractive for refugees. And in the last weeks, especially the social rights of refugees are coming under attack, and discussions on the reduction of social benefits for refugees are materializing in first social cuts that will later, and the discussions are already on the road, without doubt will also be addressed against the native, whatever that is, Austrian population. Concerning the labour market, just two final remarks and then I'm done. Concerning the labour market, two different dispersive threads are competing. The more powerful being the one also advocated by the official institutionalized labour movement, that in Austria has got quite a substantial institutional power due to a particular system of social partnership. This discourse being the amount of refugees is overburdening the Austrian labour market, and therefore asylum seekers have to be excluded from legal access to the labour market, having the effect, and thus enlarging the existing unofficial illegalized labour market, the racialized, what our colleague Prem called it earlier, that the racialized shadowy underbelly. That's an integral part also of the Austrian labour market, this existing unofficial illegalized labour market. And Austrian trade unions have in the last decades traditionally been the loudest proponents of restricting access to the Austrian labour market for non-Austrians. The second thread being a discourse of economic valorization, nourished by some factions of Austrian capital and proposing to exclude asylum seekers and possibly also recognized refugees from the existing systems of collective tariffs, which would have the exactly same effects of creating a legalized shadowy underbelly. Simultaneously, the overall racistly loaded public opinion is also the breeding ground for political attacks against the free movement of workers within the European Union. Not the free movement of capital or goods or commodities, but the free movement of workers, primarily addressed against EU citizens from Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia. And discussions on limiting access to social benefits for EU citizens from Eastern Europe are taking place. Nowadays, the politically motivated and media-orchestrated notion of a new Völkerwanderung, that's the conservative German term for the migration period in late antiquity in Europe, a refugee flood or a refugee tsunami that has to be stopped outside of the external borders of the European Union, dominate the public discourse. And a political climate has been created that led to considerable militarization of Austrian society, with private arms purchases, Susan Zimmerman mentioned it earlier, being on a record high, right-wing vigilante groups popping up all over the country, and an unseen and really unseen increase in racist violence against refugees and other minorities. My concluding remark, overall, the last months have led to an increased polarization in Austrian society, which has been actually taking place over the last years, but now there is some signs that this crisis, the so-called crisis, might be the start for a deeper political polarization. And the peculiarity of the situation in Austria being that the predominant right-wing anti-asylum and anti-refugee discourses have a corresponding political expression in the landscape. Whether this polarization, and that's kind of, the phrase you always say, but I have to say it, whether this polarization will lead to a new political formation, and that's major discussions are taking place within what's the Austrian left, aside from the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party, will depend on the social debates and conflicts of the near future. You're all eager to have lunch. I'll finish here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for these four very interesting presentations, and thank you for being patient. Waiting patiently for the lunch. In order to avoid this mixing up of the program, I suggest that we still have 5 more minutes for the discussion. So please come with your questions. Attila. No, Attila is not the question. József. Attila, József,